Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Crave Connection In Product podcast. Today, we are recording our first group session. For those of you who haven't tuned in previously, I'm Adi, founder of In Product and host of Crave Connection. Today, we are joined by the speakers from our last In Product Meetup, Building Meaningful User Connections. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
So building meaningful user connections was a really big topic. We all discussed it at our last meetup, and we knew we were never going to, I suppose, get to the bottom of that topic. Miriam, you led the panel discussion and you were in absolute control up there in your oar. So tell us, why was it important for you to discuss this topic specifically?
Yes, happy to. So I feel like we've all been there. It's busy and hectic start of life, and we realize suddenly that we haven't spoken to a user in months. So I think for me, over time, I realized how important it is to make it a regular exercise to speak to users. And also, I feel like I've also realized in certain startup environments, maybe that you don't have to have user researcher as your job title in order to take responsibility to do it. And so I feel like overall, I've learned how important it is for me to make it a regularity to build those connections. And then thanks to the wonderful keynote by Sean in our product meetup, it's started to make us all reflect on what meaningful actually mean. And I think for me, meaningful connections really mean that I walk the talk, I think you say. So I really immerse myself into their shoes and I really start feeling that empathy for our users. And then what does meaningful mean for them? So why is it worthwhile maybe spending the time with us in these calls and giving us their time? And lastly, we also took the angle, which I was very happy about, of what does meaningful mean for the business? So why do our stakeholders feel like it's meaningful for them that we build those connections and that they also shift their mindset maybe towards more user-centric ways of working? So yeah, there were so many angles to cover and I'm really excited to continue the conversation.
Yeah, it's, I think, one of those things which we're doing day in, day out is talking to our users, doing user research, but actually taking the time to step back and think about why are we doing that and what does that actually mean, I think is a really valuable time spent. So Sean, Beez, Alicia and Sarah, building meaningful user connections is part of all of your day-to-day roles. And with that in mind, in actually taking that time to invest in thinking about why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing it, what have you taken from that evening? Has there been anything which has been like refocused in terms of your approach or your thoughts at this point? Sarah's up.
Yeah, so I think just to kind of keep it brief, I think sort of for me, the focus has been on making every connection count. So making sure that the notes are captured and shared for team members that weren't in those calls, making sure that the insights are discoverable for the future when I dive back in to an area that certain piece of insight would be useful for, because, you know, there's often so many things that come out from every call that is really useful that you might not have gone into that call looking for, but you know that this is something you might come up again, making that easily found when you do prioritize that area and making sure that you're really listening and you're sort of taking advantage of all of those great insights that come from those calls. So yeah, making every connection really count.
Nice. Beez?
Yeah, I think what Sarah said is really interesting there about the other team members and everyone else within the organization. You're doing this user research, and so quite often it's just the yourself and maybe the product team that get this insight. Whereas on the night, I think what was discussed was, you know, internal marketing and sharing those user insights throughout the organization. I remember many years ago, I was a bit obsessed with this book, which was like Steve Krug's Rocket Science Made Easy, I want to say. You know, it's like usability testing, like a way to usability test. And one of the things I took away from it, I'm sure I don't remember anything else from it, but was that you can often be the user researcher in a separate room, doing that user research, having a video following that, and have as many people from the organization in another room watching that back and doing their own analysis of what's going on during that process, which I thought was really interesting. I haven't actually had an opportunity to do it like that, but I did find that quite interesting.
Nice. Sean?
Yeah. Something else that came to my mind, we also touched on this a little bit in the evening with these two, like the idea that you don't necessarily do or don't do meaningful user research is not such a binary thing, right? I think we went into a bit of detail with the team about how you're really playing a game of risk reduction and talking about like getting a diverse set of perspectives that are being brought into your product development processes. And so it really, the name of the game is like how much do we think we're building those connections and understanding the inputs that are coming from our wider user base, rather than saying we know exactly what our users do or don't want. And so thinking about when we're building up these processes, we talked a little bit about taking incremental steps forward, trying the next smallest thing. And that's something that I think we've also been looking at even just recently, since we had the meetup at Birdie, about, what are the bases that we have left uncovered, and taking really like a risk reduction approach to some of our upcoming releases, which I think, I'm very glad we had the conversation as a team because it's something we could put into practice straight away.
Really nice to see that that's led to further team discussions, because that is exactly the purpose of the evening, to go away and continue the conversation. Alicia?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with all the points, but one of the things that I took from that evening is it feels that we all share the same problems and perspective about meaningful relationship with users, and it was a great to reflect on the topic, and also it's quite awesome to see like all the designers and research and product that we are quite aligned that we think this is important, and how we can communicate with other people in the team and in the company that why is that important, why we need to do building this relationship with users. And yeah, I'm just taking to just try to reinforce like what we shared the other evening, like try to share it with the rest of the team to make it more like a strong case in the team.
Nice. I think it was the same from the audience. Everyone who came, could see the importance of the topic, whether they were doing, I suppose, user research independently or with a team. There was that appetite there to improve and to talk about it. So I think that's really positive. Sean, you kicked us off with, I suppose, on the evening with the introduction of the topic, and you started with meaningful for who. Can you share a little more on your view on building meaningful user connections?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we've kind of touched on, there's many common elements, but when you really break it down, that element of meaning is a connection. A connection by definition is a two-way street. And so one of the things we were going across as a group is that there's kind of the meaning for us and our business and our team. You might break that down into the actual product team that's working on what you're building. We might talk about our service teams that are supporting those users. And there's obviously the meaning for the business. Oftentimes this might be looked at as, kind of the hard business metrics and things like the adoption of your product, the engagement that your customers are feeling, insights that go into your product development process. That's meaningful for us because that's going to help us build a better product. But ultimately, that connection has to be felt the other way as well. And so it has to be meaningful for the participants in your research. That could be directly with your users and them having the right incentives to have a say in the product that they're using, and they want to actually help co-create it with you. But particularly in a B2B context, there may be a difference between your user and your buyer, who might have a different set of incentives and how they're trying to support their organization, which then ultimately ladders up to the business on the other side, who could be using your service, especially in a B2B context. They're probably looking to get a certain value and a certain impact from your solution in their business. But I think that process applies equally in a B2C context as well. So it's just remembering that building these meaningful connections has to have both value for you as a product team and ultimately for the people that are participating in that research. And it's trying to connect those two together at scale that I think is the challenge that we all face as practitioners when we're trying to build these products and serve a wider market. So it really behooves, I think, all of us to understand in our unique context, what is the incentive for those users to have a say in what they're building, making sure that we translate that into some meaningful product outcomes and that they can see the results of that work through rapid iteration, feedback loops, and the like. That's what I feel like actually makes the meaningful at the end of the day when you have those user connections working.
I think it's really nice to actually take the step back and look at what meaningful is, because it's a word I think that probably can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, as you've said there. Actually reflecting on what meaningful means within your organization is really important. Sarah, Sean introduced us to co-development programs as part of the keynote as well. And one of the areas which you focused on was actually how that in reality and actually making it work without friction and how that's been so important for you and other team members. So can you tell us a little bit about how you've seen the co-development sessions successfully work, how you've made them, I suppose, as frictionless as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think And Miriam does an amazing job sort of really coordinating sort of with these co-development partners. So yeah, hats off to Miriam. But I think a really key thing is setting expectations up front and sort of being very clear on both sides, kind of what the time investment is going to be, what the format of those calls are going to be. And so once you've actually got those in the calendar and everybody's on the same page of, how much time is going to be spent, how often is it going to be, it then is for them to show up and us to show up and to really make the most of those calls. And I think for making them run smoothly, coming back to the point around, making every connection count, I think here prep is really, really important. And something that I have found you absolutely need to invest the time in. Firstly, establishing what are the learning goals for each of these sessions are there? Or if you want to observe them using your product in some way, have you enabled that in your test environment for them? All these little things are really, really important to make sure that every minute of that time is spent meaningfully, both for you and for them, and you're really respecting their time that they're taking out of their day to come and talk to you. Being aware of what you spoke about last time is another really key one. So before you go to the call, making sure that you're not asking them questions that you've asked before, that another team member has asked before. So, there's an element of continuity there as well is really, really important. So yeah, I would say that's the key. There's the initial investment up front and sort of making it into a system, but then sort of on a call by call basis, there's the individual prep, which it might seem like a lot, but the amount of the benefit, the return on that investment is just so much greater versus, sort of doing it on the fly. So I think that's a really key one. And as a result of all of this, something that has been really, really evident to me is how critical it's been for us to maintain speed whilst gaining that confidence and, getting something production ready. It takes a lot of invisible work, to the user. So things like back end work, putting in unit tests, making sure it's going to work fast, investing in the performance, and all of that is investment that if you are making that on the basis of wrong assumptions, it's much, much more costly later on to fix those incorrect assumptions. And we've been able to, what we've essentially done in the last sort of few weeks is we've been front loading a lot of the front end work, or we've been creating prototypes to learn much, much faster and much more cheaply, so that when we actually do make that sort of heavier investment, it's with a lot more confidence. And so we've been able to maintain that speed. So it's just been a fantastic program for enabling that, really.
Nice. And in that conversation, we were talking about the benefits of systematizing user research and how that, I suppose, we're removing friction, making that kind of like part of your day to day. But then I suppose on the flip side of that, we also want to look at more, I suppose, unique and creative approaches sometimes to approach user feedback, which is what you kind of started discussing, Beez, as well, around like co-development is kind of pivotal to your approach with community-led design, but a core focus being kind of getting in front of people who we're not hearing from all the time. So tell us about some ways which you can approach recruitment and user research differently.
I'll try and answer that question. However, I just wanted to also pull in something that Sarah said. So one of the reasons that's so important is because Sarah mentioned the wrong assumptions perspective. And sometimes I almost split the user group into sort of three. You've got your what we might consider the typical user who, is digitally competent and can just get on with everything as whatever you put in front of them. And you might have another type of user who is empowered to really want to take your product on board and is the first person to use it and involve it in their, an early adopter, essentially. However, there is a third group, which is sort of the opposite of those two, who is really reluctant to take on your technology, who may also be perhaps a little bit digitally excluded, or depending on the sector you're in, and it's obviously totally contextual. However, it brought it back to something else that, the wrong assumptions part also comes when you're testing your product with users who are not actually aligned with the users who will actually be using your product at the end. Because sometimes, I think one of the audience members mentioned that sometimes when you're working B2B, the other organization is reluctant to give you their actual end user. So maybe you end up with a manager or someone else in the business, or as Sean mentioned, there's a difference between the buyer and the user. But maybe you don't end up with the actual end user. You may end up with someone slightly removed from the day-to-day process of using your product. It's still user research, But whether it's valid user research, that's a whole other question. And so getting to an end user who uses it day to day is probably reluctant to have their processes changed in the first place, may be used to even a quite difficult system to use in terms of digital usage. Moving on from them, trying to find them and speak to them, that's actually that recruitment process. That's really, really key. Like, how do you actually get to those users that are most impacted by not being able to use your product effectively? And so I feel like that you almost have a moral obligation to do that well, because their job is essentially at risk by the fact that their entire system is changing. Because if they can't use your product well, they may feel like they have to move on from the workplace or whatever it might be. For especially if you're working in Birdie in the care sector or something like that, these are people who are really on a living wage and not much more, and they might be expected to take on new technology. So there's this whole process of considering, right, there's 3 types of users and we're trying to get to this end user. Recruiting those users, well, that's fascinating, isn't it? And I think it's totally contextual, and it's in part about persuading those gatekeepers who may well be the buyer that, it's really important for you and your organization. There's real value for us to speak to the actual end user. So we need to find an incentive for the buyer to want to have that the process of integration of technology go much smoother and much faster. And that's a reason, that's a strong incentive for a buyer to say, oh, actually, yes, let's provide an actual user for this research process. The second one is you can also provide feedback back to the buyer, which I think Sean has already mentioned here, quick, or maybe it's Sarah, but quick feedback to the client on what changes you've made according to the user research that you've done will encourage other users, and that user, if you manage to get to them, to share the enjoyment they had being involved in the user research with the user researchers, with other potential candidates for user research that may have been reluctant previously to join in the research process. So it's almost like you're trying to persuade a gatekeeper, you're trying to do a great job when you're doing the user interview so you get more user interviews, and you're trying to really decide whether you actually have got a representative user. Because the validity of your research, I know it's so difficult to do, but sometimes you need to scrap the research you've done. And that's really difficult because obviously all the decisions within your product are resting on whether you do a great job as a user researcher. And so you have to be willing to say at some point, actually, I did all that user research, but we can't use it, and I need to go and find some more users. And that's quite tough.
So not much to do then. A really simple task, I think, with what we've described there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity to it. And one of the, I think, key things that stood out to me, Beez, about your conversation when we met as well, was the not looking for a persona. I thought it was quite interesting. So how in kind of reality, are there any creative ways which you would say that you can also go about recruitment outside of like getting the kind of the people who you are working with on that co-development program to recommend and to share that kind of experience?
It's really, really contextual. If your users are members of the general public and you know where they hang out and what they do, you can go to those places where they hang out and where you can shift the power. So there's a power dynamic in every user research situation. You as the user interviewer quite often have the power and the other person does not. So there can sometimes be like a power dynamic that is unhelpful. So if you can flip that power dynamic and end up in situations where they have the power in a community situation where you're doing the research, that can change things as well. Obviously, you need to get consent and everything. So you can have these on-the-spot interviews like you might do within their own work setting. So you could go to, if a buyer is buying your product in, you could ask them whether you could sit in their office or their workspace and do on-the-spot interviews with people. Maybe over lunchtime, you could provide a nice incentive of, as we know, pizza probably, or something like that. But you can find ways to be in a situation that you feel more uncomfortable in and they feel much more comfortable in, so that you can flip the power dynamic and be willing to put yourself out in those places that feel uncomfortable. So I think it's almost like moving out of your office and moving off screen. So I think a lot of interviews at the moment are being done online, which is great. It's amazing. However, there is something to be said for going into the space of other people and to do those interviews contextually in those environments.
Sarah, I believe it was you at the meetup where you mentioned that you went round with, was it a window cleaning business that you'd been round with previously, and you spent all day like doing their role and seeing how, the challenges they were facing in that day to day?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just about kind of putting yourself in their shoes as literally as you possibly can. And I find that in a less formal setting, that's where you get the really interesting insights, because people are more comfortable. They're in their space. You are in their space. So coming back to that power dynamic, I think that's a really great point, Beez, that, if they feel comfortable, if they feel, that it's their space, then, words just come and they're much more free flowing. And so, yeah, it was an amazing experience and very insightful.
And I think Beez mentioned in the meetup as well that sometimes like feedback isn't rational. So I suppose actually being there and seeing that and seeing how people are working and what blockers they might be facing, what they might be telling you that they are struggling with might not actually come back to rationally what is going on in that scenario. So I think that that's really interesting to see, especially when you're working in a certain space. You must kind of do the same thing day in, day out, and not be able to have that naivety where you're asking questions about how particular things work. So has anyone else got any experiences they want to share about how they've kind of conducted research creatively, or any kind of wins which they've had with that? Miriam?
I have done a project that was on food waste, which is, I guess, a good example of how sometimes you want to portray yourself in a way which is not actually the case. And to overcome this, how people portray themselves, it's often so good to ask them to bring things. So in that case, we asked them to take a photo of their fridge and their bins, etc., and come with that, not really knowing what the topic was about. So then we could break the ice and be like, hey, we all know that's the case, instead of asking them how much food waste they do. And that was really helpful. So asking them to bring things to the table, or bringing photos yourself, trying to like photo sort or do something with pictures, is always a good idea to get away from the ideal and go back to their reality in their real life.
Love that. I think we all want to think that we're doing the ideal scenario and we're all perfect, but pictures definitely tell the truth. So Alicia, you've worked with both a dedicated research team and without. This kind of conversation at the meetup started, I think, with Beez mentioning around how important the customer service team is in being like your user research team. So in terms of how you've gained user insight without a dedicated user research team, which isn't as formal as like a co-development program, are there any insights or ideas you can give us on how you've done that?
Yeah, I think is try to utilize a bit all the resources that you can in the company. So I worked before in like really small startups where everything needs to be really fast and needs to be iterated really fast and quickly. And in the team, there is people that are in contact with the users or the buyers, and then you have the customer support that are normally dealing with problems from the users, and then you have also the sales team that are constantly talking with the buyers of the product. You need to be a bit careful with the feedback that you are gathering from the team, because you can have like a really strong user that is constantly complaining or constantly demanding for features is maybe really helpful for them, but not the direction that you want in the company. But it really gives you an understanding of what is needed or what is lacking in your product. And it also kind of touching a bit like the difference between buyers and users. It kind of gives you the bridge of like sales team will talk with the buyers, customer service will talk with the users. So you have a bit of like both perspective at the same time. So yeah, I did that. I also did like some visible, do you have a problem type of form somewhere in the website or in the app, that it could be to a Google form, and then you manually review what the people are doing. And the last bit kind of link of like creative user research, but this wasn't a user research, it's more likely with creating empathy with the team. We did, when I was working at Fedia, we did like an exercise where each person in the team was a role in a situation where a person needed to verify themselves in the phone. And it's like different situations, like they have a baby in a taxi while they are going to the airport. How do you go through the like phone identification form and like trying to make sure that everybody is like understanding that no, it's not always the first ideal scenario where you are going through the form and like everybody understanding all the steps really clearly. There are things outside that are influencing your users, and sometimes you need to really make sure that everything is really clear. So yeah, these are some of the bits that I've done when it's really useful to have a user research team and really dedicated time, but you have some tools that you could use on your team.
Nice. So I suppose opening this up to everyone, one of the main conversations which stood out to me, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, was that sometimes user behavior is not rational. And that's where I suppose stakeholder management becomes quite tricky and storytelling becomes important. So when you're trying to turn that irrational, sometimes behavior into rational thought and communicate that with stakeholders to gain buy-in, how do you focus on? Are there any guidance that you would give in terms of building that narrative around user behavior, Alicia?
I think it's kind of trying to understand of like the jobs to be done. So instead of like characteristics of the persona, what they want, or it's more like what they are trying to achieve at the end of the day. And there will be multiple ways of doing it, and there will be things that people will do in it different ways, but trying to understand what's the end goal and trying to explain the different ways of users doing to achieve that end goal maybe will explain a bit better that irrational actions that everybody does.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, in terms of pulling out what is the story out of rational and unrational behavior, I think something that I have found to be really helpful is really trying to ground those stories in reality. So you have data, you've got your qualitative stories about what happened based on data, and then why did you behave that way in that moment is where you can really get those stories out from conversations with people. Why, like, is the why behind that data point, really. And so if you're grounding it in reality, kind of to Miriam's point, it's kind of that difference between what someone thinks they would do in a hypothetical situation and then what they actually did in that moment, and really trying to pull that out. And I think once you've got that sort of reality, you can then start to unpick what is rational behavior and that you can plan for and around versus maybe some that you might want to omit from your plan to optimize because it might be a bit more of an anomaly and you don't expect to see it again. And I think that's where kind of product sense becomes quite important. It's not really a science, but you can build a sense for what you think sort of needs to be solved for and what you can let go, because you can't necessarily solve for everything. But I think getting to the why in reality is really important. And then in terms of kind of getting stakeholder buy-in, a technique that I learned from an amazing resource, actually, I would recommend people checking it out. It's growth.design. It's a lot about sort of ethical behavioral science in UX and product design, and what they talk about is this sort of 6-panel storytelling. So what you're doing is you're kind of creating this storyboard and pulling the user, kind of a sort of putting the persona out of the screen. So quite often, if you're looking at a screen by screen of a user experience, it's quite difficult to really get the empathy for what that person might be feeling going through that flow. Whereas if you actually have a little person, could even be like a stick person, with a sort of an expression on their face of what they are experiencing when they see that screen, or they're on their sort of mobile device and they're in the airport with the baby in the back of a taxi, as to Alicia's point, kind of what actually might they be feeling. It actually really helps to build the empathy with your audience, why we need to be really focusing on this part of the flow, or why this story really matters and why we're going to be investing in it. So that's a technique that I found helpful.
Nice. Beez?
It's interesting because I think that's part of solving the irrationality perspective. I think the storyboards is a great structure. However, also so are other some system design practices, because, for instance, behavior is often irrational out of context. So when you don't know the broader picture, it feels irrational. However, it might be rational if we can understand more about the system around that behavior. However, there is a problem here. So a lot of organizations do not have a dedicated user research team. And a lot of organizations, I think Alicia mentioned, the startup, you've got to move fast. Sarah mentioned, you've got a product team and you've got to do those small wins and you've got to decide what to work on. And that's part of the problem. To build out a picture and an understanding of this broader system, you need the time to be able to put all of that user research you're getting into another area, a map or something, which takes resource from your team, because you've got to decide how far you want to go into understanding that irrationality. Because what if you could build a proper map, like a systems map, or just really understand the reasons behind those levers that are going on, the other things that are going on in the system, all those drivers of behavior, then yes, you could do something incredible based on that learning. However, you've got limited resources. And so I think there's this whole process in user research, right? We've got to win this stakeholder over. How far do I want to go into making them understand this irrational point? Is it going to have as much difference? Is it going to make as much difference to the product as I'd like it to? So you're always weighing up all these decisions. I probably think, from my perspective, being an outside research for organizations, I almost see it as if I've got a number of chips that I have, and every time I have a conversation with a buyer or a stakeholder, I'm sort of paying out one of those chips. So I have to decide how many chips I want to use on this issue. So I've got to decide, how important is this to that organization to know this point, because they're busy as well. So and the product team's busy, the developers are busy, the designer's busy, everyone's really busy. So you don't want to take too much of their attention. So another function of you as a user researcher is also to be that filter. You can put all of that information somewhere and save it for later. But you've got to decide, is that irrational story one of those things which is game changing? Is it a game changer? Is it one of those things that Sarah mentioned, some of those you have to just leave, but some of those it's like, oh wait, I've just had an insight into something that is literally the game changer that will change everything, and I'll pay out all my chips to try and be the person who's going to sell this into the organization, because it's going to make the biggest difference going forward. And I think there's this whole process of deciding how valuable is both the irrational story that you've gained, and how valuable is it for you in that process of having to put out all that energy to sell it to the team.
I feel like that's a podcast in itself, to then start thinking about, how do we decide whether it's rational or irrational, or where do we bring in that product sense? So for another time. Dawn?
I just wanted to underscore the point, because I think, frankly, it goes back to that original topic of meaning and like creating change within your organization. Like we touched on a little bit, like the stakeholders that you're telling the story to. Distilling your research shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all activity. If you're trying to communicate a deep problem to your engineering and product team versus like frontline support staff versus getting investment for a new team from executive leadership, you should be thinking about the level at which you're trying to tell a very detailed story versus looking at trends that are maybe across like, a larger set of different research activities that you've done. And then ultimately, again, trying to qualify, hey, based on this, we have a hypothesis for how we could improve the bottom line to our business, create more meaning for our users at the end of the day. So just that point of like remembering your stakeholder group, you might want to figure out what's the kind of change that you're trying to drive for, and then tailoring the playback of your research results accordingly.
Loops back to what meaningful is. So we've come to the point where I've got a couple of questions for you from people who attended and people who weren't able to attend. We had really good audience engagement, so that was amazing, but we're never able to answer all the questions on the evening. So we've got one, which was from someone who attended and they're working in PX. So her question is, I've been applying user research methodologies from product design to people experience work. And one challenge I consistently face is balancing depth versus scale. In products, we might do intensive research with a few users that represent thousands of customers. In PX, stakeholders often expect representative samples from larger employee populations. How do you convince stakeholders of the validity of focused qualitative insights when they've become accustomed to large survey data? And what techniques have you found the most effective for demonstrating that small sample, in-depth connections can reveal more actionable insights than broad, shallow engagement? Big question. A couple of questions in a big question. Who's up for the challenge? Beez.
It's interesting because I think they're two completely different functions. I mean, obviously, from my perspective, in-depth research you still want it to be repeatable, so you've got to do more of that research. However, you're just getting to a point of saturation where people are saying the same thing, so you've hit that point. This larger kind of number, like shallow and loads of people, is actually more like quantitative data. So it has its place and it's really, really bad. However, it tells you different information. It might tell you the what's going on, but it won't tell you the why. And Sarah already touched on that actually quite often in product design, why is sometimes more important than the what. Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes it's more important than the what. And I think it's really persuading the person who you're selling this into that, look, there's two questions we're answering here. We're answering the what through number of people, what's going on, but we need to also know why they're doing it. And to do that, we need to focus in on a few people and go really deep. The only problem there is resources and resource change. And I think it might be that thinking about the language that the other person is using. If they're using language that's normally associated with quantitative data, they're probably quantitative and numerically minded. So you need to find a way to translate that qualitative data and the idea of going in depth with people into the same language as someone who would understand quantitative data would accept. Actually, this was a big problem in the social sciences, actually. So it might be worth them looking through some of the papers within that sector, because I think I can't even remember. I'll have to find out and I can drop you and you can put a link in the end. But there was someone who had to write a paper which has changed. Is it the Eisenhardt method or something like that? Which is like a multi-case study method, or maybe I'll have to figure it out. But who basically explained why qualitative data was valuable. Because before a period of time, actually, it was mainly quantitative data. And I think, obviously, for most people's mindset, that's what sticks in their mind. Oh, if we do enough research, like a whole load of research, we'll have representative information, even if it's really, really shallow. Whereas actually, you reach saturation quite often, quite early during the in-depth process sometimes.
Nice. Anyone else have anything to add? Miriam, I saw you nodding away.
Yes, I would like to add what Beez just said. A study I found helpful quoting when it comes to speaking that language is by Nielsen and Landauer. It's from 1993, and it's called The Magic Number of 5 for Usability Testing, which really explains why 5 is a good enough number for qualitative research, which people often find quite interesting that it's just 5. And then you reach this like point where I think 85% of all problems have been covered. So that is a really good study to go back to. And another point I take in arguing for qualitative research when it's about in-depth is the time aspect. I always say you can just use one day where you do 5 interviews for 1 hour with users, and at the end of the day you can take a product decision based on what you've learned. It's so much quicker and efficient than doing this large scale survey. So I feel like time and efficiency can also be a good angle to come to when it comes to doing qualitative in-depth research in that case.
Sarah?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that's so interesting about that point about there being 5. Coming back to Beez's point about the information giving you different things, I think it's all part of telling the full story. We might have the what, and that tells the story as to what is going on, but inevitably the questions then are going to be, well, why is that happening, and therefore what action should we take? And you can't really answer that question unless you understand the why. So so this is what's happening, qualitative, large scale sort of aggregate data. This is why it's happening, that you pull from those individual conversations, and therefore this is what action we're going to take. And then that is the key that presumably stakeholders are wanting to know, is that what are we going to do next? And so it's kind of, all different parts, I think, of the story, and you sort of need to touch on all of them most of the time.
Sean?
Yeah, just one quick build on that too, is I think particularly the way this question was framed to our group about like large employee bases and trying to get the representative sample down, it can be tempting sometimes to assume, that correlation is causation with some of these larger populations. And actually having a diversity of methods can help you from falling into some of those traps. If you can take the qualitative research that you're getting and back it up with some qualitative insights that prove that things are actually kind of in line with your mental model for how people are perceiving those changes, that can be a really good defense against sometimes, just going with the loudest user feedback or the most engaging story might also blind you to trends that are happening in the wider user base. So I would say actually there's a hand for both, depending on the kinds of questions that you're trying to answer. And it's important to take every research result that you get with a pinch of salt too, and just making sure that you've covered your bases before you're embarking on particularly wide-scale changes.
Brilliant. One final question. So this actually came from someone who didn't attend and weren't able to. So although engagement and retention are common metrics, establishing a true emotional connection is more challenging to quantify. So the question is, what metrics or qualitative signals do you use to assess whether you've successfully created a meaningful connection with users? Sarah?
Yeah, just kind of coming back to what we started with and what Sean was talking about is, well, firstly, you want to define what does meaningful mean for each of the parties involved. So establish the mutual benefit, because for it to be meaningful, it really does need to be mutually beneficial. Otherwise, someone's time is being wasted. So are we living up to our end of the bargain? And we have tested for that is, are they engaged in the cause? We've sent out a survey asking for feedback and what did they say? They want to continue on with the relationship. Those are all signals that they are getting the value from those connections on their side. And then are we getting what we need from the call? That's also important. Are they showing up? Are they engaged? Is kind of similar signals actually on both sides. Is are we getting what we need from this relationship? And is the feedback that they're giving insightful? I think it's an important question to ask because, otherwise the nature of the connection changes. It doesn't need to be mutually beneficial. So, yeah, those are ways that we've tested for it.
Nice. Alicia?
Is one of the questions that is quite interesting to ask to users is how will they feel if they can't access to the software anymore? Like, do they feel like they can't replace it with anything, or they feel like it's okay, I can just do something else? Like, then you can see, are they really enjoying being part, like using it? Are they really having the problem solved by having your software or not? Like, it's quite interesting to get what the users will say. Like, tomorrow we switch this off, how you feel about this, and get their feedback.
It's really nice. It brings it absolutely to life, doesn't it? It's like grounding in the reality again.
Yeah, I love that question, Alicia. It's sort of like you can measure really qualitatively with the survey of like how disappointed would you be? So I say like if the question is really have you created that emotional connection, ask emotional questions. Anything that requires your users to take risk. For instance, making a recommendation of your software to someone else, like word of mouth. I think in my mind, if you're willing to advocate for, hey, this is an awesome solution, would you be willing to give us a testimonial or a case study about it? That for me is a bit of the better bellwether than just are they retained, are they continue to pay for your software? I'd probably go that next step and like really try to probe. The emotion is going to require some sort of outsized action from those users. And you can ask for that directly. I don't think there's any harm in seeing their appetite to make that recommendation. Kind of how sad would you be if we took this away from you? And, if they're very sad, well, please don't take it away.
Well, thank you all for investing your time and energy into the topic. To close us off, something I would love to hear from all of you about, and there's been lots of actions that we have discussed throughout this podcast. So I will add in links and everything we've discussed that we think we can actually go off and tangibly find, and areas and techniques I'll make sure that we put a link to. But I'd love to hear an action from all of you for our listeners. So this could be someone in your network which you think that people interested in this topic or interested in products should be following. It could be books to read, podcasts to listen to, or even like a piece of advice that you'd like to share with like our community members. Alicia?
I actually think, following from what Sarah mentioned before, I think it's quite important to document your insights and share it with the team. I personally don't do a great job documenting what I learned from users, but I think it's a really great tool to gather all this information and share it with the team. Make sure everybody understands the uses that they are building on, and I'm just gonna try to be better at that. Yes, right.
I like that, Alicia. You're holding yourself accountable in this as well. It's documented, it's out there. Sarah?
Yeah, I am kind of building actually just on what Sean said. It made me think about a lot of writing around reference customers coming out of Silicon Valley product group. They do a lot of blogs, and in particular, Christian Idiodi, he's done a really great podcast episode with Lenny's podcast. You can get it on Spotify or number of podcast providers, but he talks a lot about, firstly, recruiting people with a problem that you're planning to solve. They have to really care about spending time with you to solve that problem, and it's in their interest for you to solve it well. And to establish it with them, your intention up front and not being afraid to be really clear about that, by working with me on this, my aim is to solve this problem for you so well that you not only want to pay for it at the end, but also tell all of your friends all about it, put your reputation on the line and advocate for this solution. And so that makes that relationship, establishes the mutual benefit for both of you, that we are solving a problem that you have that's painful to you. And we are going to do it so well that you at the end are then compelled to pay for it and tell your friends about it. And I think that's a really good thing to establish up front. So yeah, to read more about it, I think type in reference customers on Google and look at Silicon Valley product groups writing on it. I think it's really, really insightful.
Thanks, Sarah. Sean?
Gonna maybe borrow something I said at the meetup, that like we talked about so many different actions. I feel like the most important thing for groups that are struggling to get started is to just take that first small step. So if you're not performing any user research activities, just maybe try one and see how it goes. Try and find that first customer you can reach out to. And I do find there's a lot of value in just tracking some of these things. How many insights have we shared, across our wider group in the last few weeks or month? Yeah, how many of those interviews have we conducted? And if you start tracking these things over time, like, hey, we haven't done any in a while. And it's kind of a signal to kind of keep moving on these. Because a lot of the techniques that we've discussed today are things that, as you have a stable practice, you can kind of layer on more and more rigor into your processes. But sometimes the hurdle is really just to get that buy-in and get started. So I would say, find that first research you can do. If you're having trouble with a stakeholder, have that first conversation with them. How can we get some buy-in for this? But yeah, use it as an opportunity to get started with the insights that we've shared today.
Thanks, Sean. Beez?
Yeah, I've got two really, but they're not really books. The first one is Let Go of Perfect. I think as user research and product people, we love perfect. Once you let go of it, and it's not, a lot of the decisions we make are actually not one way, they're two way. We can backtrack, we can go back. And a lot of testing is about A/B testing anyway. So you're going to discard one decision and go with the other anyway, right? So there's no difference here as well. You can make bad decisions and go and review your research again and take another decision. So let go of that perfect. It doesn't really matter. And that will maybe allow you to take Sean's advice of just going and doing more research, or any research if you're not doing it. The second one is embrace silly, basically. Be creative. I think user research and user researchers are quite often stuck in the academic process of what user research is meant to be, or what the books tell you it's meant to be. However, at its heart, user research is just talking to people and listening deeply. That's literally all it is. It's just having conversations. And outside of that, none of the other rules matter. So have conversations, speak less than the person you're talking to, and try and have fun with it. Do something fun. See what happens.
Nice. Thanks, Beez. Miriam, you're last.
Yeah, I would even build on what Beez just said, and also Sean, and that is to spend one whole day with a user, which is maybe the more advanced method. But I think instead of just spending this 1 hour digitally on the screen, to just go out, and what Sarah basically did is accompany them for one whole day, so you see the whole context in which actions take place, has been so valuable. So for us, for instance, working at Birdie, I remember that in the beginning we just spoke to them for 1 hour, but once we've visited them for one whole day, and you do the live of Accurx with the app that we are providing, and you see how it happens day to day, that was, I think one that not just was very valuable in terms of insights, but for me personally, I think I took so much of my purpose of my work from that moment that I would say, like, if you have the access, try spending a full day.
Or even try to simulate it. I know in this conversation, you've tried to put yourself in different scenarios as well. So if you don't have that access, that could be another option. Well, my last bit of advice to everyone is to come along to an In Product Meetup, because that is honestly the highlight of my course every time we do an In Product Meetup, because we have absolute superstars like you guys coming along, sharing your experiences. And it's hard to describe, but we seem to have created a really lovely atmosphere where people feel really free to speak about what they need to speak about, be honest, share their opinions. It's not always about getting the perfect answer. It's about setting the scene, having those conversations, and just, starting those conversations a lot of the time. So a huge thank you to all of you for making this possible. A huge thank you to everyone who came along to the meetup, and a huge thank you to all of those who are now going to come along to the next meetup, because it's going to be fabulous. So really appreciate it. That's us done here, and we've successfully completed our first group podcast. So here's hopefully to many more.